might sometimes limit our focus in studying the parable to the prodigal son alone. But in fact, the parable begins with the notation that there was a father who had two sons. Our focus tonight will be on the latter of those two sons. The fact that this parable draws our attention to two sons suggests that there are two ways to be lost. We might say there's one way to be lost, and that's sin, and that's true. But as depicted in the parable, people sin in different ways. The prodigal son dipped his toes into the pleasures of this world, and he went off on to an excursion that many people experience and others think they would like to experience. His brother, on the other hand, didn't do any of that. He simply stayed home, worked in the field, served his dad faithfully, did what he was supposed to do the way he was supposed to do it. And there's certainly nothing wrong with any of that. But if sin causes a person to be lost, and it does, then people can sin in different ways. People can sin in the flesh, and they can sin in attitude. The prodigal sinned in the flesh. His brother sinned in heart, in attitude. Now sometimes we're pretty hard on those who sin in the flesh, and there's good reason for that, I'm sure. But on the other hand, sometimes we will issue a pass to those who sin in attitude because that's just the way they are. And we feel as though we just need to deal with it or whatever. But this parable, in very interesting fashion, presents to us both worlds, the world of the flesh and the world of attitude. And both are wrong. Now, the prodigal son, as you know, sinned away from home. His older brother sinned at home, but both were guilty of sin. Jesus sets the stage for this picture early in the chapter. In fact, the basis for the parables itself can be found in the opening verses of Luke chapter 15. And you know all of this, I'm sure, but just as a refresher, in Luke 15, there were tax collectors and sinners that drew near to hear Jesus, much as we mentioned earlier this morning with regard to Matthew's house in Matthew chapter 12. Very similar situation here, where publicans, tax collectors that is, sinners, wayward people gathered around to listen to Jesus speak. Pharisees and the scribes murmured, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." And that was all that was necessary to provoke Jesus to take advantage of this as a teaching situation. So, in verse 3, Luke tells us, "And he spoke this parable to them, saying," and a series of parables now follow. The first one is the parable of the lost sheep, begins in verse 4 and goes through verse 7. The lost sheep. But when that sheep is found, there's great happiness. The second parable, that of the lost coin, begins in verse 8 goes through verse 10. But when that coin is found, there's great happiness as a result. The next parable gets us into the study that we're about to engage in. Beginning in verse 11, a certain man had 2 sons. The focus now is on the younger of the 2. Most of this parable will involve him, of his intentions, his decisions, his leaving home, his life afterward. It rings very familiar with people who have been there and done that. And the rejoicing continues for those who have been there and done that, but have come out of it and come back, came to themselves at some point, and returned to the Lord and consequently to His church. And there's great rejoicing as a result of that. So in this situation where the younger boy leaves and dips his toes into the pleasures of the world and has had all he can stand of that, and decides that he's going to go back home and take his chances with Dad, beginning in verse 20, he arose and came to his father. And when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And sometimes you'll hear me ask the question, can God run? And it's based on this verse. The son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring out the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand, sandals on his feet, and bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let's eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found, and he began to be merry. But then the older son heard all this, and he wouldn't participate. He wanted no part of it. The text tells us here that he was angry. And you have to wonder, in verse 28, but he was angry and would not go in. Why was he angry? What was there to be mad about? Was he disappointed in his father's grace because the father had grace and welcomed the wayward boy home? Was he disappointed in his father's grace? And this is where we get the phrase, holier than thou. It comes from that disposition, that sort of attitude right there. Angry because the father wrapped his arms around the son and welcomed him back. Does that mean that he excused what the son did? No. Did that mean he issued a pass on his wayward activities? Of course not. The son sinned, he came to himself, and he returned. The father was glad for that. The Father in heaven is thusly represented. And sadly, sometimes people are not accepting of His grace, as in the case of the elder son here. Sometimes I wonder if it's easier for us, as Bible readers that we are, good students that we are, if it's easier for us to see ourselves in one of these 2 boys. Is it easier for us to see ourselves in the picture of the prodigal son, if you've ever been there and if you've ever done that? And if you have, then you know yourself, how you are. You know your weaknesses. You know your proclivities. You know your dispositions. You know your addictions. You know your own demons. And you might even admit, I was there, I was a prodigal at one point. You can see that in yourself. It's not hard to see it. It may be hard to admit it. But it's easy to see ourselves sometimes in the prodigal son. But on the other hand, is it easy at all for us to see ourselves in the elder brother, who would not share in the joy of the father, of a repentant son come home, who was angry at the father's grace, who argued that I've been here all of these years, I've served you faithfully all of this time, and you're making a big deal over this guy who has gone out and spent his life with harlots, we would say prostitutes, and now he wants to come back home and you want to roll out the red carpet? Holier than thou attitude. Is it easy for us to see ourselves there? I predict not. It's not easy. It's very difficult. It's almost impossible for us to see ourselves in the elder brother. Now, it may be easy for us to point the finger, but not to take the punch. We can point the finger sometimes, oh yeah, you're that and you're this, you're that, whatever. But we can't take the punch if we are the one that's reflected in one of these two. My focus tonight, obviously, is on the elder brother. You know the story of the prodigal son. Let's think about the rest of the story tonight for a little while. The older brother, as the Bible calls him, as the parable calls him, older son. Is there anything good about him? Can you find anything good to say about the elder brother? Well, there's a little bit. There's a little bit of good, yes. We could be hard on him. I have to fight the temptation tonight, but we are thinking about him. So what good can you see in the elder brother, the older son? Well, for one thing, and maybe this is the main thing, in verse 25, the older son was in the field. All right? What does that mean? He was in the field. That means he was home. That means he was doing what the boys were taught to do. And it's like families long ago, and some even still. The kids had to work. Yeah, the father had hired servants. They ate pretty well, but still the boys had to work. So the older son is out in the field. That's good. That's where he needed to be. And that's where the prodigal son should have been. But he wasn't. But the older son is out in the field. That simply means he was busy, he was working, and he was doing right by his father. That's good. And we can compliment him for that. And we can learn something from it and hopefully imitate the principle that's taught in the goodness here of the prodigal son. But the next point that I would give you is not in the text necessarily, although it might be implied. And the goodness that I see here is that the older son was not the first one to greet the prodigal when he came home. The father was the first one to greet him. And the father was the one who came running, arms open, smiling, cheering, making all of these plans. Kill the fatted calf, bring on the robe, put the ring on his finger. All of this celebratory mood from the father, but none of it from the son, the older one. So I'm glad, for the sake of the prodigal, that his older brother wasn't the first one to meet him when he came back home. Because if the older son had met him first, probably would have been pretty hard on him and very likely would have gone back to the pig pen. So maybe there's some good to be found in that. Again, that's just my suggestion. I'm not saying the text teaches that, although it might be implied somewhat in the background. And by the way, what we're dealing with here tonight, in my mind at least, reflects what we talked about this morning. Hosea 6 and verse 6, "For I desire mercy and not sacrifice." Take those principles reflected in Matthew 9, Matthew 12, Mark 12, bring them forward here, and I think upon just a slight examination, you'll see them reflected in the parable of the prodigal son. Now, the great lesson that we hear, that we receive from Jesus, is that Jesus knows people. And one of the reasons that Jesus was hated by the religious elite of his day was because Jesus pointed out sins in people. He pointed out sins in wayward people and in people who thought they were faithful. He pointed out sins in the lives of people whose sins were known, as in the publicans and the sinners. Their lives were known. People knew what kind of people they were. And yet he pointed out sins in the lives of people who were not known, as in the elder brother here, who was in the comforts of home, doing everything the way he was supposed to do it. And yet his attitude was such that he was holier than thou. And an attitude that kind of gives this parable a negative note toward the end, until the Father has the final say. The great lesson that we get is that Jesus points out the sins of people that are known and sins that are not known. He speaks here of one who is too good and one who is too bad. And sometimes religious people fit within that category of those who are too good, or at least think they are. Is there some good in the elder brother? Yes, there is. But the parable focuses on the other side of that, the bad. What about the bad in the elder brother? Are there some problems here that we need to take note of? Well, of course there are. And Jesus very clearly brought them out. For example, in verse 28, what I will call the spiteful attitude of the brother. In verse 28, notice it. But he was angry and would not go in. Therefore his father came out and pleaded with him. Now it's easy to overanalyze a parable. I'm trying hard not to do that. Because when you overanalyze something like that, you miss the main point, and we don't want to do that. But he was spiteful, angry. Again, what was there to be angry about? Well, I come back to the idea of the Father's grace and how that the older son was disappointed in that grace, how that the Father would extend that grace to such a weak-kneed, wavering, immoral boy as the younger one, and yet repented and came back. Are we ever disappointed in God's grace? And you think, well, no, that can't happen. But it can. It happened to Jonah. Jonah, chapters 1, 2, 3. The prophet of God was disappointed in the grace of God. Read it. You know the story, but read it. And then in Matthew 20, in verses 1 through 16, Jesus gives another parable. We call it the parable of the vineyard. And it's where an owner of a vineyard goes out and hires workers. He goes out early in the morning and he hires workers for a denarius a day. He goes out at the third hour, he hires workers and he says, "What's right, I'll pay you." He goes out at the 6th hour, does the same. 9th hour, does the same. Goes out at the 11th hour, finds people hanging around, nothing to do. He said, "Would you like a job?" "Sure. Come along, I'll pay you. What's right?" They work for 1 hour, then payday comes. And everybody gets paid the same. And those who were hired early in the morning said, "Now wait a minute here. They worked only 1 hour, and you mean they're paid the same as we are? That's not right." But then the owner of the vineyard said, "Look, didn't I hire you for a denarius a day? Didn't you agree to work for a denarius a day?" "Sure." "Then what are you upset about? Everybody's paid the same." And then Jesus makes the point, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Many are called, few are chosen. Struggle with that parable to grasp the meaning of it. We still struggle with it today. But there's grace underlining the teaching of that parable. Are we disappointed with the grace of God? The elder brother was, Jonah was, the worker in the parable in Matthew 20 was. And then there's your story. Where do you fit into this, if you do? So the elder brother, spiteful, angry at the grace of his father. Secondly, selfish. Look at verse 29. So he answered and said to his father, "Look, these many years I've been serving you. I never transgressed your commandment at any time, and yet you never gave me a goat that I might make merry with my friends." It all rings very familiar, doesn't it? "Lo, these many years I've served you." Literally, that means, "Lo, these many years I've slaved for you." Because the word servant there is from doulos, slave. I've slaved for you all these years. So, is worldliness fun? Is sin fun? And religion slavery? Working for the Lord, slavery? Work? Sure, you work in the field. You work in the vineyard. But is it slavery? You're a servant of the Lord. But is it not important to you? Of course it is. So there's selfishness here. And we see it reflected. And yet there's no joy. He doesn't share in the joy of the Father who opens his arms of grace. Sometimes people make it to the baptistry, but they don't make it to the Spirit of the Lord. And the elder brother is an example of it, sad to say. And then finally, in verse 30, he reflects his own superiority. "But as soon as this son of yours came," notice he doesn't say brother of mine, "this son of yours, who's devoured your living with harlots and killed the fatted calf, then you welcome him back in open arms." Superiority. Your son did all of this, wasted all of your money, engaged in all of these pleasures, and yet you never did anything for me. So there's the superiority in verse 30, and again gives rise to the concept of holier than thou. I wonder sometimes if in our preaching we're harder on lusts than we are on lovelessness. I don't know. I wonder if sometimes we're harder on covetousness than we are on callousness. If we're harder on sins of the flesh than on sins of attitude. And yet both are reflected in this parable. And the parable ends with a very vivid picture of holier than thou. Am I there? Is that me? Again, it's easier for me to point the finger and say, yeah, that's you scribes, that's you Pharisees, you no-gooders. That's you all over. And it was. But it's very hard for me to take the punch if that happens to be me. And I have to look inwardly and assess my own heart and ask, do I have that kind of attitude ever? Am I ever unhappy with the grace of God? Am I holier than thou? There's nothing good about that. But it's reflected here, and it's for our thinking, for our reflection. And notice again how the parable concludes. As I noted earlier, the father has the last say. And he said to him, Son, you're always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive, again is lost and is found. Does anybody here fit that category? Anybody here tonight fit that category? Was dead? You can be alive. Was lost? Outside of Jesus, you still are. Can be found tonight, but only in the arms of the Father, coming through Jesus Christ the Son, through the inspired word of the Holy Spirit to empower you to move and to think and to act tonight while we stand and sing to encourage you.